and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we now turn to the great poet Edgar Lee Masters. I'm with you in your hymnals on 645. The first thing that we want to do, we will put out two things about Masters before we turn to two of the poems from Spoon River Anthology, Lucinda, Matlock, and Richard Bone. The first thing we'll do, though, is write down his dates of 1868 to 1950, so you can see that we are moving now in terms of our conversations to authors that are now dying later and later into the 20th century. Masters is an interesting guy for a number of reasons. Let's just jot down two of them. One, here is a classic example of a person who starts out working in another profession. He is not a professional writer, as your biography says for you on 645. For years he practiced criminal law in Chicago. He is a lawyer and then starts to play around with poetry and ultimately becomes a very famous poet. The thing that changes Masters' poetic career happens in 1914, and I hope you're reading with me on 645 in that first paragraph. A pal of his gave him a book called Selected Epitaphs from the Greek, and it was an anthology. Now, let's get that epitaph word down so that we know what that word means. I would write that word down right now at level 1 or at level 2B, either place it works. An epitaph is what is written on a tombstone. Okay, so you want to write that down. An epitaph is what is written on a tombstone. So, for example, you live, you die, they bury you, and then they write something on your tombstone. That piece of stone, or sometimes in the old days wood, that sat over your grave. The epitaph usually has at least three things. I'd write this down. Usually it has the full name of the individual and any kind of nicknames that maybe went along. It's going to have the date, birth date, and death date. And then normally an epitaph will have a third thing, which is some kind of words which speak directly to the life that was lived by that individual. Most of the time, not always, most of the time the epitaph is going to be inscribed by people who knew the individual. In other words, you don't write your own. Other times people would write their own. The Greeks started playing this game, and Master starts reading some of these, and he comes up with an idea that's revolutionary in some ways. He will write what we call the Spoon River Anthology. Read with me on 645. Using the structure suggested by that anthology and abandoning conventional rhyme and meter, Masters wrote a series of poems about the lives of people in rural southern Illinois. Now, the word rural, you should know what that one means because you live in a rural community. In other words, the middle of nowhere, southern Illinois, okay? And he invents this anthology that is going to be built around people who live in this small town, okay? The collection called Spoon River Anthology becomes so popular that Masters can quit his law work and become a professional poet for the rest of his life, and a very successful professional poet. We now turn to two of the poems from Spoon River, starting on page 646. And the first one we're going to look at is Lucinda, Matlock, and the second we're going to look at is a poem called Richard Bone. But before we go there, I want to start actually at 2B, so you want to write this down. Do you see on 646 at the bottom of 646 in a box there, it says dramatic monologue. Do you see that? Dramatic monologue. You want to write that term down at 2B. Dramatic monologue. We want to define this as a form of poetry, and then we're going to set ourselves up for the study not only of Masters' work, but we're going to also talk a little bit about the poetry you're going to see as a senior when you do begin to study other dramatic monologues. Now let's talk about dramatic monologue. First of all, let's make sure we understand the difference. If I'm having a dialogue with you, then that means you and I are speaking, right? Dialogue. So what is a monologue? Okay? Jot down what you think that is. If a dialogue is two people speaking, what is a monologue? Mono meaning one, right? So what is a monologue as opposed to a dialogue? Well, if two people are speaking dialogue, monologue, write it down to be one person speaking. One person speaking. Alright? So a monologue is just one person speaking. Okay? In language of the theater, we call this, of course, the soliloquy. Same thing, the soliloquy. In other words, somebody is talking out loud and the audience is hearing what is being said. So now let's go to the first of the two phrases, dramatic monologue. What does it mean, dramatic monologue? We mean that we will have some kind of situation where you will have a speaker speaking to someone else, but that someone else is usually never named and never speaks. That's what makes it a monologue. Alright? Now, the people who speak in the Spoon River anthology are people who have all died. I would write that down, it will make more sense. The people who speak are people who have all died. Okay? And in the process then of having them speak, they will have the ability then to know, well, we will have the ability to know and learn something about their life. Alright? We're going to have two of these dramatic monologues. And by the way, just to point out really quickly at 3A, other text study, 3A, probably the greatest of the poets who wrote these dramatic monologues was a guy named Robert Browning. He's there mentioned on 646. You will study Robert Browning and some of his classics in your senior year. Probably the most famous or infamous of his dramatic monologues we will study in your senior year, called Porphyra's Lover. We'll speak about that one when you are a senior. We're now going to turn to two of these offerings by masters from Spoon River Anthology. The first is an offering called Lucinda Matlock, and the second is Richard Bone. I would write this down really quickly at the top of the annotations for both of these, just so you can be reminded. The speaker of the poem in the dramatic monologue is the person named. He or she will not be named in the poem itself, because in the poem, he or she is speaking the entire time. In other words, at the beginning of Lucinda Matlock it says, I went to the dances at Chancellorville. The I is Lucinda Matlock, okay? And she talks then for the whole poem. But there's no quotation marks in a dramatic monologue. In other words, she's just talking the entire time, okay? Now what we want to ask at level 1, and you want to write this down so it's a question to set you up as we get ready to hear this read. What we want to ask is, what do we learn? Two things. What do we learn about the individual speaker? And what do we learn about the community of Spoon River? Okay? So two things. One, what do we learn about the individual speaker? And two, what do we learn about the community that that speaker lives or grows up in? Okay? Sometimes doesn't grow up in because, in the case, for example, of Richard Bone, will come to visit and then stay and live. Alright? For all of us who live in a town of 4 stoplights, we get a sense of what this is to grow up or live in a small town. Spoon River is something very similar. So you've got all this interesting stuff that happens in a small town like this, and we're going to derive some of that from these poems themselves. So all we got to do now is follow along and listen. I'm with you on page 646, and we'll go ahead now and pay some attention to Lucinda Matlock. Follow along, okay?
Lucinda Matlock by Edgar Lee Masters. I went to the dances at Chandlerville and played Snap Out at Winchester. One time, we changed partners, driving home in the moonlight of middle June. And then I found Davis. We were married and lived together for 70 years, enjoying, working, raising the 12 children, 8 of whom we lost ere I had reached the age of 60. I spun, I wove, I kept the house, I nursed the sick, I made the garden, and for holiday rambled over the fields where sang the larks, and by Spoon River gathering many a shell and many a flower and medicinal weed. shouting to the wooded hills, singing to the green valleys. At 96, I had lived enough, that is all, and passed to a sweet repose. What is this I hear of sorrow and weariness, anger, discontent, and drooping hopes? Degenerate sons and daughters, life is too strong for you. It takes life to love life.
Okay, let's now pause for a moment and do a quick annotation of this poem. The first thing, again, we want to point out is that this is a speaker speaking from her grave. She's dead, okay? As is all the cases of these poems, all right? About her life, she will say one or two remarkable things that we want to write down. There is an argument to be made that really here we don't have one poem, we have two poems. I would write this down. We really have two poems. The first poem is Lucinda talking about her own life and who she is. The second poem is Lucinda talking to you. And in many ways, this is one of the things that made these dramatic monologues of Masters so powerful. At points, the speakers will actually speak directly to the reader. And sometimes, as in the case here, that reader can be indicted. Let's go ahead and look at the things that she says about her life. Notice the thing we will point out is she lives 96 years. Old lady, 96 years, okay? She will live with her husband for 70 years, we're told. She found him, his name was Davies, all right? Notice that she says she raised 12 children. 8 of them died by the time she was 60. Okay. Notice the kinds of things she said, she did. I spun, that means she sews. I wove, I kept the house, I nursed the sick, I made the garden. For holidays, rambled over fields. Many a flower and medicinal weed, she says, she picked down by Spoon River. Qualify for yourself at level 1 what she says her life was like. Some would call it boring. She would say something maybe a little different. Notice she says that she actually enjoyed her life, right? And then she says, finally, at 96, I'd lived enough. That is all. And that's the end of the first part of the poem, really, in many ways. She says, 96 is a long time to live. Wow. I was done. I'd had enough of all of the things of my life, and I died. But then she says she passed to sweet repose, rest. Then, though, there is the second poem. I want you to be reading with me now, starting at line 18. Because as we look at this second poem, you as a reader can feel as if there's a little bit of maybe an attack. Notice, what is this? I hope you're reading it with me at line 18 and following, on page 646. What is this I hear of sorrow and weariness, anger, discontent, and drooping hopes? She asks an interesting question. At the end of 96 years old, she says, what is this that I hear that people say that life is full of sorrow and weariness, anger, discontent, and drooping hopes? Now, let's point out for your notes really quickly, this is a woman who easily could have experienced and probably did experience all of those things. Would you agree with me? She probably did have sorrow. Notice, she lost 8 of her 12 children by the age of 60. So she watched her own kids die. So clearly had sorrow, right? Discontent means unhappiness. Possibly happened for her as well. Notice weariness. Probably, if you live 96 years old, you get a little tired. But notice how she asked the question. She says, I'm hearing people talk about life as if it is not good but bad. She says, what is that all about? Then look at what she says at line 20. Notice, degenerate sons and daughters. Whoa! I would write that word degenerate down. It probably will end up on an examination. It's one of our vocab words. Degenerate sons and daughters means something is wrong with the young people. The young people who say that life is nothing more than sorrow, weariness, anger and discontent, and drooping hopes. In other words, life sucks and then you die. This is a 96-year-old woman who says to young people, what is wrong with you? And then notice she finishes the poem by saying something very interesting about living. I've had one or two junior readers that look at these lines and go, whoa, this old lady is lecturing me. Take a look at what she says. Life is too strong for you. Notice the dash. And then her final thought, it takes life to love life. You might want to write that final line down at level 1. It takes life to love life. Well, let's work it to a real quickly impossible themes and messages in a poem like this. Go ahead and jot down what for you is the most obvious message of a poem like this, as an old lady of 96 years old is giving you a lecture about her life. Notice she will say that life is hard. Life is for her really long, 96 years. But she learned something in 96 years, and it is that life teaches you to love life. Notice that her position at level 2A, messages, themes, her position is not pessimism. Her position here about life is life optimistic. Live your life well. Don't complain. Another major message. Don't complain. Don't be sad about the sadness in your life. It is the pain in your life that makes your life worth living. Now, when you turn and look at a poem like this, you can be reminded of an idea that T.S. Eliot will make famous in his poem, The Hollow Men. So let's jump really quickly to a 3A observation here. Of course, at 2B, we've already made the observation real quickly for you that dramatic monologue is what we're looking at here. It's kind of a fascinating way to write a poem. To have a dead person of 96 years write to you and say, hey, life is not a bad thing at all, and I should know I lived 96 years of it. Hang in there. Don't quit. You're too weak if you start whining about how bad life is. But I want to turn now to 3A. And I want to pay attention to a textual study in your senior year with me called The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot. The Hollow Men. And in this poem, he asks you to imagine what it's like to die and then go and sit down and visit with your great-great-great-grandmother. Imagine this for a moment. So you die and you go visit with your great-great-great-grandma, somebody who you don't know, somebody who you know existed but you don't know who she is. And you sit down with her and you start saying to her, great-great-great-grandma, you don't understand. My life is so unbelievably hard. You don't get it. My life is tough. I mean, I got to live in a place like now. It is hard. And we got cell phones and everything is so Can you imagine your great-great-great-grandma looking up at you with eyes and just going, hard? Are you kidding me? Do you want to know what hard? Let me tell you what the life I lived was like. Hard? You're telling me hard? And you, all of a sudden your eyes lock up. And then Eliot will say in The Hollow Men, I don't want to look at those eyes. I look down. When she looks with direct eyes at me, I don't want to look at her. This poem will play a very similar game. Jot down at 3A for you, what is your favorite movie about a tough old fart? What is your favorite movie or TV show about somebody who's old but is really tough? Not a wimp at all. Somebody maybe who's older than the young person in the film who has to teach the young person something. What is your favorite movie or TV show about somebody who is old but strong, not weak? What's your favorite movie or TV show about life is beautiful even if it's painful? Do you have one of those shows? Maybe a video game. What is your favorite song right now on your playlist? What is your favorite song about living life even though it's hard? Don't quit. Hang on. Even though it's difficult. Because the longer you live, the more you will gain knowledge about how precious life really is. This 96-year-old woman saying, life is tough, but it's worth living. Let's turn now to 3B really quickly. And obvious questions come to mind here. What is your view about life? Do you think that life is kind of hard? Do you think that life is kind of a pain? Do you think that life is kind of boring? Let's just play a quick game here really quickly. Write down the date you were born. This will blow the minds of some of you. Write down the actual date of when you were born. Go ahead, do this. Write it down at 3B. Because I'm going to make this kind of personal for you. Write down the actual date you were born. And then add to that year 50. Go ahead, do it. I challenge you to do this. 50. That will be the year that you turn 50 years old.